Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 68, March 26, 2007. We're visiting with Paul Symens, Farmers Union Marketing and Processing Association Director, former South Dakota Farmers Union State Board member, and former state senator. Paul, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1943, July 15th, just a mile across the section over here on the main farm place where my folks were living at that time.
Okay, and where's that from, Amherst then?
Just a half a mile south.
Okay. Where was your family originally from?
My father came here in South Dakota when he was 3 years old, from Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
His father before him had been born at Galena, Illinois.
Okay.
And my mother's family immigrated to the Britain, South Dakota area in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s.
Okay, and where were they from?
They were from Norway.
Okay.
So I'm a half-blood Norwegian, half-blood German.
Okay. You have brothers?
I have 4 brothers and 4 sisters. So I came from a large
I knew
family.
about the brothers, but I didn't know about all the sisters.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you want to tell me what their names were?
Well, the oldest was Aletha. She's living now at Hayti, South Dakota. And then Irwin is living just across section over here, farm together.
Is this in order of age?
This is in order of age, oldest to the youngest. And then David is in Northfield, Minnesota. Herman is at Sisseton, South Dakota, farms and ranches there. My sister Karen is at Castlewood, South Dakota, their farm there. My sister Doris is now in Watertown. She's retired and moved to Watertown. Brother John I farm with here at Amherst. And then Sister Faye is the youngest, and she's in Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, basically. So.
Okay. What was your father's name?
Father was Wilbert. My mother was Inga.
Okay, you want to talk about him a little bit? What sort of people were they?
Well, my father graduated from the 8th grade, never went on to higher education than the 8th grade.
Fairly common in those days.
Fairly common. Went home to work. Always wanted to be a architect. That was his lifelong dream, but he didn't like the arithmetic and the calculus and the geometry and all of that. But he, in fact, was pretty much a bona fide architect. He designed a lot of buildings and built a lot of buildings in his lifetime, homes and shops and garages and whatnot. Did a lot of things through the years in the building trades, as well as farm. And after he retired in 1966, moved to Britain, built 3 more homes there after he retired, and loved to use his hands in building furniture and houses and whatever. Mm-hmm. Helped many people through the 30s and when he was starting to farm to build things, because that's the way he made a living.
What about your mother?
My mother was born here at Britain, South Dakota. She met my father when she worked as a hired girl during thrashing for my grandmother Symens, and that's where they met. And she never had any college education. She did graduate from high school, and she raised 9 children. Always had a big garden. Sewed most of the clothing. Did everything that most of the farm wives did back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Mm-hmm. And did a very good job. Loved all her grandchildren very much. So,
what are some of your early memories on the farm here? This, I suppose, would be very late 1940s, early 50s.
Well, being born in 43, my memories go back to, I suppose, the late 40s. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I went to school all my life right here in Amherst. I never was in a country school because we were just a mile from a consolidated school district in mm-hmm. Weston Township. So I spent my 12 years going to school in Amherst, small school. Mm-hmm. I remember one of my first jobs on the farm was taking care of the chickens. I had to feed the chickens and gather the eggs and do that kind of thing. I was never one that milked a lot of cows because I had older brothers that did that. But I got in on the tail end where we milked a few by hand. But that was about the extent of my cow milking experience. But on the farm, we always had a very full farm. We had never had the workhorses when I was there, but we had the livestock, the cattle. I remember them milking cows as a string of cows. But when I got older, we never did that anymore. But we had hogs and beef cattle, fed beef cattle, raised beef cattle. My father was one of the first crossbreeders in the country that really started to experiment with crossbreeding and prove the success of that. And always was interested in the SDSU and the extension services, and took a lot of things. He was one of the first people that started to fertilize crops. I can remember lugging those 56-pound bags of fertilizer when I was hardly big enough to hold it, handle them. And we did a lot of that before it started coming in bulk. Mm-hmm. So that was, a varied experience, but we did it all when we were farming, as well as Dad was a firm believer in doing everything himself. He fixed his own machinery and fixed his own buildings, did all of his own wiring and that kind of thing. So I was brought up in that kind of a circumstance where we did all of those things.
A bit of a different era than today.
Oh yeah, much different than today.
Farming was quite a bit different then than it is.
Oh yes, terribly different. I mean, you look at what we do today and the yields we get and how we plant and all of those things. It's totally different. Mm-hmm. When I was young, I drove a tractor. We disked everything in the fall. We dug everything in the fall. We plowed it in the spring. We did all of those things, and now I'm still a firm believer in using a chisel plow, because in our soils, when we haul manure and have cattle on the cropland and so forth, we need to loosen it up some. But we haven't used a moldboard plow for 15 years or 20 or something like that. So it's a different era, and the machinery is different.
Mm-hmm. Were people still thrashing around here in the early 50s? I South Dakota.
A very few. I mean, it was the guys that were behind that were doing that when I was a boy. Yeah. Not really very much of it. My father started using a combine in the early 40s. Mm-hmm. When we started using combines. So.
Yeah. Did your parents talk much about their experiences during the Depression in the 1930s? You talked about your dad helping people out there.
Yeah, they got married in the early 30s, after the crash of 29 and so forth. I know Dad told me when I started to farm on my own after I got married, he said that we would never enjoy the opportunities they enjoyed, because in the 30s everybody was on the same playing field. Nobody had anything, and you didn't have a lot to risk when you started farming. All you was risking was your labor, in effect, because nobody could buy anything. There was no cost of farming, like fertilizers and even the taxes and the interest and all of that. There wasn't a cost there. Mm-hmm. He tells about one of the first quarters of land that he rented. He rented from an insurance company. They told him to go out and farm it, and if he had something that he could give for it at the end of the year, by all means, they'd take a payment. But if he didn't, don't worry about it. And
wouldn't happen today.
It wouldn't happen today, and the land was reasonably cheap in those days because nobody had anything, and insurance companies and banks owned a lot of land that they had to get rid of and had to have somebody operate for them. So it was opportunity, and he said that. He says, we had to scrimp and save, but everybody was in the same boat.
Mm-hmm. Land prices had remained pretty much the same for quite a few years after the 30s.
After the crash, they were reasonable all the way through into the 50s without any problem, and even into the 70s, they were not terribly high priced.
Do you think that the experience of the 1930s affected your dad's approach to farming and other aspects of rural life?
Well, I think it affected everybody's rural life. I think we see the effects of that today, even in 2000, 2007. We're a conservative state because of, I think, a great deal to do with the 30s. All of us were raised that way. There was nothing to be had. The approach was conservative. You didn't see anybody out there plunging. The people that plunged in the 20s lost it in the 30s, and everybody remembered that. A good many farmers here that had gone out and bought some high-priced land in the 20s, they lost everything. They were penniless, through no fault of their own. It was a matter of the time you were born and the opportunities that looked like opportunities that turned to catastrophe.
there were a lot of farms that were foreclosed on in the early
Absolutely.
30s. Was there a situation around here where some of the people who maybe lost their farms early on were able to get started again on maybe different land? Or
Some did. Some left. Many left. We had pastures up north here about 10 miles that we found blown out. It's the sandy soil, and we found where homesteads were blown out, where the remnants were there. The broken crockery and the old stove was there, and the old frying pan was there, and chimney parts, and and those people all left in the 20s, 30s.
Yeah, there were really low prices in the 20s.
Yep.
Hit farms before there was a drought.
Before there was a drought, it was a crash at 29 that made most of them penniless, and then the drought made it worse.
Yeah. Did they have a lot of dust storms around here?
Oh
in
yeah,
this area?
yeah. There was a lot of dust around here. It wasn't quite as bad here as some areas because of the type of soil we have and so forth, but it was bad. Dad told about how he could get up in the morning and it was black in the morning and it was blacker at night, and you couldn't see a mile. It was just black. So, and he tells about the first crops that he put up after they were married. They went out and mowed thistles and put them up and bought molasses so they could feed their milk cows. And they carried those thistles in and soaked them down with molasses so the cows had something to eat.
Was Marshall County and this general area supportive of cooperatives back in those earlier years?
Marshall County has always been a pretty progressive area. This whole upper northeast area is pretty progressive. The very first conservation district in the United States was right here. Western Marshall, Eastern Brown County, Northern Brown County was the first organized conservation district in the United States after the conservation legislation was passed in Washington.
1933?
It's something like that. I don't remember the year, but this was the first area that had an organized conservation district and has been going strong and doing a lot of good things over the years. Back in the 60s, my late 50s, I guess it was, my father earned one of the prizes for a conservation farmer, and won a seminar or a learning experience at SDSU when they put those on, and they're still doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's a good program.
Were your parents active in cooperatives around
Oh, yes, very active. Dad was a member of the Britain Co-op when it organized. He became a member right away and always worked with Farmers Union and
the Amherst elevator here, too?
The Amherst elevator, he was on the board for many years on the Amherst elevator. The Britain Senex Co-op, he was on the board for many years. School board, church boards, they were a part of all of it.
When did the rural electric program bring electricity to this area? Remember that?
We actually, where I lived, we had electricity long before the rural electrics did. Because we had a generation plant, but we had electricity from Northwestern Public Service.
That was kind of rare.
Because we lived along the highway that took it to Amherst, so we got it. Many of our neighbors never had electricity till the co-ops came in. But we enjoyed electricity. When Father was a boy, of course, they run it from a wind generator and batteries in the house. When Northwestern Public Service went by, we hooked on. And we were ahead of most people in having electricity in the community. But this place is on rural electrics. My brother Irwin's a quarter mile off that highway. He's on rural electrics. They wouldn't go a quarter mile.
So you're actually still on the
They would hook
Northwest.
it up. The main place is still on Northwest Public Service.
Okay.
Yep.
You're here.
This place, we're on Co-op here.
You're on Co-op.
Lake Region Electric.
Okay. You know when the first co-op was organized around here?
I can't answer that. I don't know exactly when it would have been.
Would it have been the Britain co-op, or was there some other? Was there a creamery co-op here?
There was a creamery co-op, but I don't think it was the first one. I think the Senex station in Britain, or the Farmers Union Central Exchange, was the first co-op in the area.
Okay. Was there a co-op elevator at Britain too? Or was
There is a co-op elevator yet today at Britain. It's a locally owned co-op, but it's affiliated more with the Continentals and the rest of the chains of privately owned rather than a GTA co-op.
Always a continual problem with local farmer-owned co-ops that not necessarily
Right.
carrying on their business with regional co-ops. How many co-ops are there around here? There's the elevator, there's the oil company.
Right now our Four Seasons co-op Britain extends a long ways. We've got the Britain Senex, the station, with all the farm products and farm delivery products. That elevator or that unit is tied with the elevator here in Amherst, the elevator in Claremont, and also tied together with a big cooperative fertilizer development at Groton to furnish fertilizer to the whole area. And then we were tied together with Hecla and Frederick and Columbia. Now some of those have closed their stations, but we've been tied together with them for a number of years. We're also tied together now. Four Seasons goes down to Redfield, Condé, Pierpont, Bristol. So we cover a considerable area.
I think.
Yeah, we cover a big area.
What was it that your family liked about co-ops? Obviously, they've been members for a long time.
My father could remember when he didn't have a place to sell grain. Excuse me. And he believed in doing business with themselves, believed in doing it with the community and being a part of the community rather than seeing somebody come in and offer low price and carry it away and nothing coming back for it. So he was a firm believer in co-ops and the co-op structure and working together in a community. And that's really what a co-op is.
Yeah, certainly there was a lot of profits that were carried off to places like the Twin Cities
in
the early years of agriculture out here.
And to some point still are, But the co-ops helped maintain and put a lot of farmers out here that could at least have a chance to exist out here and to work and live.
Were your parents active in Farmers Union?
Yeah. Us children, when we were growing up, we never were because they weren't organized that well for education and those kinds of things. But as being active in the organization, yes. Dad went on trips to Washington in the first bus trips and the first fly-ins, and back when North Dakota sent their plane down and flew them in, he was on those trips. So.
You said you didn't attend country school. You attended school right up the road here in Amherst.
Right.
What was that like? How many students did they have there then?
Well, the high school, I graduated in the largest high school class that ever graduated. We had 13. That was our senior class. That was a pretty good sized class. Yeah. I mean, and I can't say I don't think there were 13 the year it graduated, but at times there were 13 in that class. So that was one of the largest classes that the school ever had. But basically, the 12 classes would amount to 100, sometimes 110, 90 to 110, something like that, as a regular attendance, 8 grades and 4 years of high school.
More kids in the low grades than in the upper grades.
At times, it varied. I had a brother that graduated with 3 in his class, and I had and anywhere in between that, 3 to a dozen, So.
Now, where do they go to school today? They go up to Britain?
Most of them are in Britain. A few of the southern end here ended up going to Langford, but most of them are in Britain. And now part of Claremont's in Britain, and Hecla's in Britain, and Lake City and Kidder, and
There's been a radical decline in the number of kids on farms who attend school.
Our
school
schools
threatened by the new
the 100 number. I don't know of any that are right now. Langford is well above 100, and that's our closest school other than Britain.
So they've already seen the consolidation.
Yeah, we started consolidating pretty heavy here in the early 60s. A few of them even earlier than that, but Amherst closed their doors on the whole school, on the high school in 66, and the grade school, I suppose, was probably about somewhere in the early 70s. Our youngest children went to grade school in Amherst yet after the high school was closed, but or I should say our oldest children went to school in Amherst.
Mm-hmm. You talked about your dad having ambitions to be an architect. What did you want to do when you were young? Did you always want to farm?
Well, that's what I knew. So yeah, it was just natural that come back to the farm.
Mm-hmm.
Never really looked at anything else, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And you had some encouragement from your dad to do that.
Well, Dad always said it was here if you want to do it, mm-hmm. but he never tried to tie us to it. He always said, do what you feel you want to do, and always left us free to make that choice. So
Okay.
he wasn't one to say you need to farm. I only had one brother that didn't farm.
Mm-hmm.
He tried it for a few years and then decided he wasn't going to be a farmer. So
When did you meet your wife?
we were going to school in Orange City, Iowa. That's where I went to school. I went there 2 years. I met her at Orange City, Iowa. She was originally from Iowa. So.
Okay. What's the college name down there?
Northwestern College. It's a church-affiliated, Reformed Church-affiliated college.
Okay, and her name is Faye?
Faye, yeah.
When were you married then?
We were married in '64, August of '64, and have 5 children
Mm-hmm.
after that. So
And what are their names?
Tricia's the oldest. She's now living in Minneapolis, Roseville, Minneapolis area. Jill lives right here in Britain. Has 4 children, and Jeff is up in Steele, North Dakota. He's the 3rd one, and works for a cooperative telephone company up there in the management area of that co-op. And then Stephanie is in Sioux Falls. She's in childcare. That's been her vocation. And the youngest is Warren, and he's here with us on the farm.
Oh, okay.
Married and has 2 children here, so we get to see some grandchildren up close.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's kind of nice to have one child go on with farming.
It is. You know, it's something that he wants to do, and he went to SDSU for a couple of years. And
Mm-hmm. Your brothers have kids that are in farming too?
my brother Erwin has a boy that farms here with us.
Mm-hmm.
John doesn't have any children farming with us. He's got a daughter that's over in Indiana. So
No. Okay. Did you start farming right away after college?
yeah. I come back to the farm right from college, and Dad was ready to retire. He was here for a couple of years after we were farming together. We were farming, not really a partnership, but kind of working together, and rented some land from him.
Mm-hmm.
Started that way, and then in '66 he retired, so we formed a partnership, brothers, and started farming there together there.
So you've been in partnership with your brothers then for
A lot of years.
40-some
41 years, yeah.
So when did you weren't involved in the youth program? When did you get involved with Farmers Union then as an adult?
Oh, after we were married, and I guess we had a couple of children, and I kind of started going to meetings. And the county chairman here talked to me. He said, I don't want to be chairman anymore. I've been there a number of years. He asked me if I'd take over, and I had attended a couple of meetings. That was back in the years when Ben was president, and I went on a couple of those young farmer, I and my wife, and the kids went on a couple of young farmer trips and so forth. And then once I became the county president, then I, of course, went to county councilors, and a few years later got elected to the state board.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. You, I recall you presented testimony, I think, was it a World Hunger hearing that Hubert Humphrey had in the Twin
Minneapolis,
Cities?
yeah.
About 1974, I remember
That's probably right.
I think the first time I ever met you, I think I was up here and got some input from you on some testimony.
Okay. Yeah, that was one of the earlier things I did after I'd become working with the Young Farmers Group and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
I was on the National Planning Committee for National Convention Policy Committee. I don't remember if I was there 1 or 2 years. Seems like I was there 2 years. I also served on a group that Tony Deschamps put together back in the late 70s. And it was Future of Agriculture. And it was a committee that Jack Rose from North Dakota, myself, and a guy from Texas, a guy from Nebraska, one from Utah, one from Ohio. We did quite a little reviewing and looking at agriculture from all perspectives. Traveled quite a little for that project, and wrote a lengthy report, which is still there.
Mm-hmm. Marshall County Farmers Union has always had a pretty close relationship with the cooperatives in the county.
It's always worked pretty well. Years ago, it was just standard practice to give you the 5% education funds, and it was that way at the state level too. I mean, this co-op at times was given $25,000 a year to the South Dakota Farmers Union. That, of course, slowly eroded, but we still have a good working relationship. When we need money to send kids to camp, or we need money for fly-ins, we need anything, we go to the co-op, and they're willing to help us. Mm-hmm. So it's still a good working relationship.
Yeah. Was the Amherst elevator also Farmers Union related?
Yeah, it was GTA elevator through the GTA co-op for all the years, and of course GTA merged with Senex, and we've merged at the local level too. So.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned being elected to the Farmers Union State Board. Do you remember when that was?
It would have been in the middle 70s. I can't tell you. I could find it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm thinking 1978, but then...
I think it was a little earlier than that.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because I went on the FUMPA board in 79. And it seems to me like it was like 2 or 3 years before that, but I can't say that for sure right now.
You replaced Ray Weiss.
I replaced Ray Weiss on the board, yes.
What sort of issues, that was back when Ben Radcliffe was still in his last years as president. What kind of issues do you remember dealing with as far as...
Well, our state issues were much the same as they are today. Tax system that's not good yet. Education funding. Working together is through the co-ops and through the state structures for basically communications purposes, cooperative purposes. All of those issues that are still kind of standard today when you get all done with it. We tried to do more marketing structured together with the state. We weren't successful doing that. It's interesting, things go full circle. Now we're trying to put together a livestock program that's identified. We tried to do that with grains 30 years ago with the state, and they weren't interested. So it's kind of the same thing we still have today.
Mm-hmm. We were struggling with how to get young farmers started in the 70s, and that. We have done a number of things at the state level to help that. The Young Farmer Beginner Program, the putting together, for instance, hay feed programs where we can work together. There's a number of ways that young farmers can go to the state of South Dakota with different programs, and it's work and it's effort and it's a lot of T's to cross and I's to dot and papers to fill out and all of that. But the fact is that the programs are there and they can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And back when I started, there wasn't anything like that. We were fortunate to be able to have the help from my father, but it's a lot tougher today to start than it was back then. Land prices are quite different.
Land prices, machinery prices.
Land, can you really do it even?
Well,
if you don't have
it's a good question. Can you, right now, land, we bid on some land to rent here the other day, and I don't think we got it because they haven't notified us, but I was told this morning that one guy bid $150 an acre on land. And I was told here last week that there was a guy up here that has come into the community and has put together 7,000 acres at $150 an acre. Well, that's a risky business for a young farmer to try and take on, because you got machinery cost and fertilizer and chemicals and everything else, plus the 150. you can get wiped out overnight. So that's an awful lot of risk to try and take on. Plus, a bank won't help you do that because they know what the risk is. So,
were you the last person to join the Farmers Union Marketing and Processing Board, who was originally selected for that while serving as a member of the South Dakota Farmers Union Board? There may have been some others that still serve. But,
I think that's probably true because neither Harold Nearhood nor Matt were on the board when they were selected, and neither have the other two been. So that would be true. When I went on, George Levine, I replaced Harvey Falstick because back in those days there was an age limit, and Harvey had to get off. And I served with George Levine and Adam Siddell at first.
And I had them, both of them had been on the Farmers Union Board when they were.
Yep.
You want to talk a little bit about what marketing and processing was doing at the time you went on the board? What their
Well, when I went on the board, they were strictly had only two phases. One was their livestock commodity market buying and selling in West Fargo and South St. Paul. Since that time, that's been gone. That has quit, and most
were they still doing anything with Sioux Falls at that time?
No, they weren't.
Already quit down
They'd already quit in Sioux Falls when I got on the board. And the other thing was just pure rendering.
Mm-hmm.
They were the pure rendering. They had just built, a couple of years before I got on the board, they had just built their two new plants. One down at Redwood Falls, and the other one up in Long Prairie, Minnesota. So they had those two new plants and then the two buying stations, but that's all there was. Mm-hmm. Since that time, we've become a multifaceted company. About 2 years after I got on the board, we started with our pet food division. And we purchased a small pet food plant that had basically been buying product for mink farms and producing mink farm food. We've expanded that to having 3 different plants, one in Redwood, one in Long Prairie, and one in St. Cloud, Minnesota, that handle pet food ingredients and prepare pet food ingredients for many of the large pet food manufacturers. Mm-hmm. We've also expanded into what's called a kitty litter plant, Sweet Scoop it's called, and that we take wheat and make kitty litter. And it's an industry that we got into about 4 years ago initially, and it's growing leaps and bounds. When we got into the company was selling close to $1 million worth a year. We broke up to 11 million last year. So it's an expanding based industry, and we think it has a great future. We also do a lot of work in biodiesel now. We've built a biodiesel plant a couple of years ago. So we use chicken fat to make biodiesel out of. And we have a manufacturing plant based in Redwood Falls that we make our own truck boxes, much of our own machinery and so forth. And that company has never made a lot of money, but it's never cost us anything, and I think it's saved us a considerable amount over the years, and I think it's going to expand to be a bigger company. So we've got all of those facets that are really good for us. The pet food industry has really expanded to different looking at feathers, looking at byproducts of poultry, looking at all of the other things that we put into the feed industry. Mm-hmm. So we're much more than just a rendering plant now.
Yeah. Has there been any concern about the current controversy regarding the pet food problems?
We had a board meeting just last week, and that, of course, was the first question because that had just broke. And no, it wasn't any of our ingredients. It was none of our problem. It was other problems, and of course now we know what it was. Mm-hmm. But our lines were not the problem.
Yeah.
So
people are going to continue to have to buy pet food, no matter whether they're nervous about it or not.
Yep.
They just have to be assured.
They don't have any choice. They have to buy it, but they need to know what they're buying.
Yeah. You ran for president of the South Dakota Farmers Union in 1981.
I did.
Do you want to talk about that experience a little bit? You ran against Lee Swenson.
I did. When Ben Radcliffe announced his retirement. It was an eye-opening experience. It was my first foray into politics of any kind. I often said that if everybody told me they were going to vote for me would have, I'd have won. But I didn't. And it is one of those experiences that when you go through that, you learn a lot. You find out what people are like more than sometimes you would like to know. But on the other side of that, the education is good for everybody. And when you lose an election like that, you can decide to quit and back away and forget it, or you can decide to go forward and still do something good that you believe in. And I stayed on the board. I didn't get mad and jump. I kept working with South Dakota Farmers Union in all the things that I could, and I think it's been rewarding to do that.
You eventually had a really good relationship with Lee when he was president.
I never had a problem with Lee. Sure, we would have done things different. Most people would. We never had any drag-out fights. We had disagreements in how to proceed at times, but when the vote's done, where the vote falls, that's what you do, and you go forward. You don't go out and tell stories about the Farmers Union, or you don't go out and mislead people on what's happened. You go forward.
You retired from the Farmers Union Board in 1984. That was about the time you decided to run for the legislature.
Well, it wasn't quite that early. I got interested in the legislature, but we had a term limit in District 3, and that's why I got off the board. We had put term limits in the 70s, and I thought they were a good idea for that position. I still think they are, because there's a lot of good talent out there, and I've seen many board members set their way beyond when they should. Simply the fact that they can get elected, and that's too bad, because in a job like that, you've got to keep up with what's going on in the real world where agriculture is, and in the real world where politics is. And if you're a retired farmer sitting out there not interested in nuts and bolts of agriculture, you certainly shouldn't be on the board.
Can't accurately represent
the you can't. And I get alarmed when I see that happen, and it's way too often. Because we've got good talent out there, and if we can keep young people interested in it, that's part of the game.
What were the, we talked about key issues. They were pretty much the same in the 80s as they were in the 70s, right?
They really were. Yep. I was elected in the election of 86 when I went into the legislature. Our senator that was a current senator here in 86, he came and talked to me and asked me to run.
Was that Kurt Jones?
Kurt Jones. He said he thought that I had, gone to the legislature. I had testified on some bills over the few years before that, and been active and attended meetings and so forth. And he just said, I think you do a good job, and I'd sure like to have you consider it. By the time I talked to Fay and we decided that I would do it, there were already two more people in, so we had a three-way primary for the Democrat position. Leo Peters was one from Britain, and Dennis Schultz from Sisseton was the other one. And when the primary was over that night, we were all within 90 votes of each other, but I had the most. So.
Well, this has always been pretty much of a Democrat district up here.
It's
number one, was that the number then?
Number one, it's always been number one to my knowledge.
The number from the northeast part of the state is how they
and it's always been number one. We've had a few flukes when a Republican won an election. Mike Jaspers stayed the longest, and he could have still been, I think, our representative had he stayed in the community, but he moved.
Yeah. He'll be the new Secretary of Agriculture.
Well, not Secretary of Agriculture. He's going to be the...
Oh, yeah. Excuse me.
Farm credit, more or less.
That's right.
Took Lynn Jensen's place, I believe.
Yes, I knew I saw that just here in the last few days. You were in certainly during those 80s. That was a time when Well, that was Bill Janklo's last year.
I got
you didn't
elected.
actually
I did
list
not serve with Bill Janklo when I first got elected.
it. Yeah,
I served later with Bill
with
Janklo.
George Mickelson.
I came in the same year George Mickelson came in.
How was it being a member of a minority during those late 80s?
Minority is always a tough position to be in.
Yeah.
I learned early that if you wanted to be effective, you had to work with everybody that was there. And if you were just going to be a Democrat working with Democrats, you weren't going to be effective. You have to learn how to count, and you have to learn who wields the power and who makes things happen and who can help you make things happen. So that was more or less my role to learn. And it takes a couple of years down there to get your feet on the ground and to know who to trust and to know who the bureaucrats are and to know who the lobbyists are and who you can work with and all that. So.
Is that a frustrating experience sometimes to be in a minority when you could come up with good ideas and not see anything happen with it?
Well, usually my experience has been that you come up with good ideas and you can see them mature in a period of 2 to 4 to 6 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then maybe they get stolen.
At times.
Okay.
But you also learn how to take those ideas and craft them with other people to make sure that they do move forward.
Yeah. That's not necessarily the experience of everyone who serves in the legislature.
No.
There's some people who do get frustrated with the process.
Some people won't go beyond 2 years, that initial term, because they're either frustrated or they think it's too slow or they just don't like the politics of having to go out and run an election. And that's the toughest part, is running an election every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I hated to ask people for money, for support. I didn't mind asking them for their vote, but to ask them for money is a whole different deal.
On occasion you run around the phone.
In the early years I did, not in the later years. So later years I had tough opponents all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
What committees did you serve on early?
Oh, when I went in, I was on health and welfare was one of my first committees. Agriculture was one of my first committees. Over the years, I served on just about all of them. Mm-hmm. The one committee, 2 committees that I never served on. No, 1 committee I never served on, and that was taxation, which, amazes a lot of people because I was involved in a lot of tax issues.
Yeah.
But I never served on tax committee.
Well, you did serve on the appropriations committee, though.
I was fortunate to be the appropriations chair for 2 years when the Democrats controlled the Senate in the middle 90s there.
That's an important committee, but there are oftentimes it seems like, as an observer out in Pierre, that perhaps they're not in the limelight like the State Affairs Committee is.
No, they're not in the limelight. They're hard workers. When I became chair of appropriations, when the committees were assigned, we ended up in the Senate Appropriations with 2 people that had experience on appropriations. And that was myself and Lindell Peterson. And I decided that, hey guys, if we were going to hit the ground running, we had to get some education and quick. I called the Appropriations Committee the first year into action a week before the legislature started, which not too many people had ever done. And it raised a few eyebrows and a few waves, but it worked wonders. Mm-hmm. Because we brought those 7 new members into Appropriations Committee. 4 of them were new to the legislature, and basically sat down and started going through the books and seeing how state government operated and give them that week's education before we had to really get down to brass tacks. Mm-hmm. And it helped tremendously. And we had we only had 1 person on our Senate committee that did not work well with the committee. And that was the Republican who had experience there and thought he should have been chair, but the votes wouldn't let him be chair, and he was very upset. and I had asked him when we went in the first day, I said, Lindell, your side of the aisle is going to need help because they're all new as well as my side, and I'd love it if you would help, work with your side. If you got any questions how we're going to do things, talk to me. He never worked with his side. He never helped those new guys, and he never talked to me. He just didn't like his position, and he was not going to help. So that made it a little tougher for his people, but I helped him. And one of those committee members had previous legislative experience, but never on the Appropriations Committee. And that was Les. He passed away
from Sturgis.
From Sturgis.
Oh,
You know his name as well as I do, but I can't think of it right now. But Les became a very good friend of mine in working on that committee. He was a good man there, and did a lot of work.
A lot of sympathy for rural issues.
Yeah.
It's very much pro.
And very level-headed and very fair and honest with the issues.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, not the sort of politics you might expect sometimes, at least from that western region.
No, he was not a rabid Republican or partisan that way. He was just a good legislator.
Yeah. I remember him participating in the Consumers League back in the 1970s when that still existed, and then later on with Bernie Hunhoff's Rural Revitalization Group.
Yeah.
Was it a little bit more frustrating that those 2 years when you had a majority in the Senate that you still had an overwhelming majority for the other side over in the House, so you couldn't really do what you had to work with those folks to get something accomplished.
You never had total control, but on the other side of that, to have good government, you have to have everybody working together. And if one side can't control everything, you have better government. No matter which side it is, Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, we had Democrats that come that first day of that session and said, boy, we're going to do a lot of things now. And I said, people, learn how to count. We can stop everything. We can't make anything go by ourselves. We have to work together. And it took a few weeks for many of them to really learn that was true. We had people in the Senate that were wielding power in committees that Roger McKelvus was our majority leader. And Roger and I had to sit down with those people and say, you don't handle a committee that way. You don't wield a gavel that way. You work with people. You don't call them names. You handle it fairly. You do it right. Because we had people that just, they were there to be boss. And it doesn't work that way.
I think I could remember some of those people.
Yeah, I think you can too. And we had a few sessions with a few of them. But they learned. By the end of the session, things were moving along pretty well. And that first session when we had the majority, there were a lot of bets being taken and being laid on the board by the lobbyists on what was going to happen on Appropriations Committee. Were we going to have just a straight out, heyday and nothing happened? Was it all going to come to naught? Were we not going to have a budget at all? What were we going to do? And I incorporated the help of a good number of Republicans to make sure we had a good budget put together.
Were there some legislators that you served with over the years that particularly stand out as being good people to work with?
Yes, and one of them, I went to his reception the other day in Pierre, Larry Gabriel. He's retiring now from being Secretary of Ag. He was an outstanding legislator. He's one of those guys that you could talk to, you could ask for a meeting, you could visit about the issues, you could bring him the bills, you could make changes, you could work together, and his word was always good. And there's a number of those that I've worked with over the years. There's a number of them in the Democrat Party, and there's a number of them in the Republican Party that were good leaders that just stood out. So.
What about your relationship with the governors over the years? When you first were in the legislature, it was Mickelson, then later on. You were still there when Walter Dale Miller served a couple of years.
I was chairman of appropriations when he was there.
After Governor Mickelson was killed. And then you served during Janko's second...
I served 6 years of his last 8 years.
Now, how would you compare them as far as their relationships with the legislature?
Well, when I went into the legislature, Governor Mickelson, of course, he was a huge man, a big man. And he liked to bring especially new legislators into his office to visit with him about issues. And he would set them in his couch, which almost sat on the floor. And then he would sit across from him on the arm of that couch and talk to him, way up there. And quite intimidating for a new legislator. But after a year or two, we worked pretty well. Governor Mickelson's chief of staff was Frank Brost, and he and I worked well together. If I needed something or wanted to visit about issues, I went to Frank Brost, and we worked very well together. When I was chairman of appropriations, the first year of session, Mickelson was still there. We got along fine. In fact, I give Mickelson a lot of credit for helping us with that first budget. The House Appropriations Chairman did not want to work with the Senate Appropriations. We ended up having separate hearings on all issues. She just absolutely refused to work with us. So when it was interesting, we got done with the Senate budget the same day she got done with the House budget. It was on a Friday afternoon. They went to LRC, the two budgets went to LRC, and I asked them to prepare a spreadsheet for us so Monday morning we could have the spreadsheet. And then before I left Friday afternoon, I went down to the governor's office. And I told Governor Mickelson, I said that I might need some help on Monday because both budgets were done. I had offered to the chairman in the House that we meet Monday with our chair and vice chair and sit down and look at the spreadsheet and see where we could come together in the budgets. And her response was, "I'll let you know." Mm-hmm. Well, Monday morning, she still wouldn't talk to me about it. She didn't know what she was going to do. So Monday after dinner, I talked to Governor Mickelson and I said, we've not had a decision on what we're going to do yet. I would suggest that maybe you call us down to your conference room with leadership and we sit down and work on the budget. He says, be here at 5. And we went down and we were all in the room there for about a half an hour, and then the leadership left the chair and vice chair of the two appropriations committees in there with Governor Mickelson and his staff. In 2 hours, we had the budget finished, and she got up and walked out and slammed the door, and he turned to me and says, "Congratulations." But I employed, I worked with the people to try and make good things happen, and that's how we got through it. Otherwise, we could have all set our feet, and it would have been a heyday. It would have been a bad deal.
Was Janklow a different operator?
Janklow operated different than anybody else, but I never had a problem with Governor Janklow. I could get an appointment to see him anytime I wanted it. We could discuss whatever we wanted to discuss. Sometimes he told me I was dumb and stupid, and sometimes I said just about the same thing to him. But the fact is, we had frank discussions on issues, and if I had an issue that I wanted to talk about, I had a bill one year about carbon sequestration, which is now all the talk. Mm-hmm. I brought that bill in and said that the state of South Dakota should become involved with research and getting that project ready. Of course, upstairs in the legislature, they killed it quick. I went to Governor Janklow, and between the two of us, we got the bill passed, and we did the research, and we've got a lot of it under our belt. Mm-hmm. And we know how to operate it now. Mm-hmm. And it's a coming thing, and it's going to get better all the time. We've just scratched the surface of that issue. It will be worth a lot more to agriculture in the future than it is today. But Governor Janklow and I worked together on it, and we got it done. We worked together on ethanol issues. We worked together on a number of them that a lot of people don't know about. But
as you look back at your service in the legislature, what would be your biggest disappointment? Something you didn't accomplish that you would have liked to have made some headway on?
One of the biggest things that we need to do, we've band-aided for 30, 40 years on our tax system in this state. Mm-hmm. And we're still way behind the others, and we're still losing out to everyone else. And we're hindering our development of South Dakota because of it. We're hindering our education. We're hindering our progressive attitude on many things we do because we have a bad tax system, and we punish our people with it. That's the one thing that should be changed, and should be changed dramatically.
I think Dr. Farber, who just passed away this week, kind of felt that way about the tax system.
Yeah. we've shortchanged our state and all of the people in it for way too long because of our tax system. And in that process, we help everybody around us, and that's not fair.
What would be your greatest achievement, do you think, in the legislature?
Well, when I was Appropriations Chair, we had a number of issues come into head. One of them was constant funding for water development in South Dakota. Another one was conservation funding. Another one was the new vet lab that had to be rebuilt at SDSU, the new health lab at Pier, the gas tank cleanup issues, ethanol. And they were all there at the same time. And when I was Appropriations Chairman, we put together a bill that a lot of people called unconstitutional, and I suppose had it gone to the court, it would have been declared that way. But we put in one bill a constant water funding that's still there today. We put ethanol funding in that bill that's still there today. We built the new lab, vet lab, and the new health lab in Pier. We put together a capital, what we called a capital construction fund. And we did all of those things in 1 year in one bill that passed. And it was interesting. I mentioned Larry Gabriel earlier. He was the head of the majority in the House at that time. He was chairman of the majority. And the House Appropriations Chair was holding all of these bills. They had started in the Senate, and they all went out together on all these issues in one bill. Mm-hmm. And she was holding that, waiting for us to get the general bill all done, because the general bill started over in the House, and she cleared that out of there, and it come to the Senate. Well, I hung on to the Senate bill for the simple purpose that I'd seen for many years that she would hold those bills in her hand to do with them what she wanted the last day of session. And I said, we agreed this bill was going out to do all these things. Larry Gabriel finally come to me the second to the last day of session. He says, Paul, what are you going to do with the general bill? I said, I am going to hold that until those bills that we agreed with are passed both houses and at the governor's desk. And I says, then I will guarantee that the appropriations bill will come out intact with no changes. Unless the Republicans change it, but the Democrats aren't going to. And we shook hands. Well, he says, my house doesn't trust you. I said, Larry, do you? He said, yes. I said, go back and tell him that. And about 2 hours, the bills come out of the House, and we cleaned up the appropriations bill, and it was over. But I knew that if I let the appropriations bill go forward without hanging on to it, that she would make some changes in that bill, and I didn't. We had agreed on that bill. All of leadership and the governor had agreed on that bill. And we put that all together, and that, to me, it was the most productive year I ever spent in the legislature when I look back. Also in that bill that year was quite an increase to Medicaid funding for nursing homes and hospitals. Mm-hmm. And Frank Drew, who was the head of the hospital committee at that time, their chief lobbyist, when I went to him and I said, Frank, we've got about $16 million left for Medicaid to do some things with. And I says, you guys get together and you bring to us how you want that split. And I says, if you can't agree, you won't get any of it. But if you can agree how you want it split and everybody's in the same boat, we can make this happen. He come back to me the next day with a split, and he says, Paul, he says, I went home last night and I figured, what if his numbers are wrong? So he said, I called the House leader, and she said the same numbers you gave me. And I called LRC, and they gave me the same numbers you gave me. So he says, I knew that we could make this work. And they come and they hung in there all together without anybody jumping ship. And we made that all happen. And it was a good year for South Dakota. By far the best year of any year I was there to make good things happen across the state. When we're still giving $8 million a year for water development in South Dakota, every year from that year forward, that's huge for the development of this state. Mm-hmm. And it's that way for ethanol. Look at what ethanol has become. If we had not done those things back then, we wouldn't have the ethanol we have today.
Yeah, we've gone from way behind other people to ahead.
To ahead of other people in that particular field. And that was because we were there, and we stepped forward. And it's been great for South Dakota.
Of course, one of the issues that probably concerns legislators over time is term limits. How do you feel about that? You mentioned how you felt about it with regard to the Farmers Union Board. Do you feel about the same way about it toward the legislature?
I don't. I think it's wrong in the legislature. I think in the legislature, term limits are called elections. And people should be interested enough in those elections to decide if their people that are running are doing a good job or not. I had this discussion last night for a little bit, and we had a church meeting, and a few people were talking about it. It appears to me that it's easy to say we'll take care of problems with term limits. It's not, because what you're losing at the state level is you're losing the history, you're losing the know-how, you're losing the contacts, you're losing all of those things. You can't afford to lose them. We've always had a turnover in South Dakota 25% to 30% every year, every 2 years, no matter before we had term limits.
You only have to look at the pictures of the people who served in the legislature a few years ago.
We've always had turnover. But when you lose institutional history, and you lose that ability to know who to talk to and how to make things happen, what you've done is you've taken the power out of the people's hands who do the elections and given it to the lobbyists and the bureaucrats. And I think that's the wrong way. So I lost an election by 11 votes. There were two issues that were predominant in that particular election. Term limits were one of them, and I openly campaigned against them.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But you were reelected later on.
2 years later, I was reelected handily. So.
Let's move back a little bit toward the discussion at FUMPA. You want to talk a little bit about the ownership structure of FUMPA, because it's always been a little different than the normal cooperative.
It is. It's a very unique cooperative. We have a real mix of patrons, and many of the people we do business with are non-patrons. It's always been that way. Our patronage years back was all of the people that brought us livestock to sell or bought livestock from us, or were the farmers out here with dead stock. That was our patronage. As the companies developed, as the poultry industry in Minnesota grew by leaps and bounds, that patronage changed considerably. Of course, we lost the marketing side of it, so those patrons weren't there anymore. The dead stock pickup became very high priced to maintain, and that has dwindled considerably, so many of our patrons are gone there, as well as many farmers quit handling livestock. So that's declined. But the poultry industry, by itself, has become very big business. Some of those are patrons. Some of those didn't want to be patrons. They said, you offer me the best price for my offal, for my feathers, for whatever I've got, and that's good enough for me that day. I don't want to be a patron. So that split our ownership somewhat. We had to restructure our ownership because of that. You can't legally be a co-op unless you've got over 50% of your business is cooperative. Mm-hmm. And it was getting so we weren't there anymore. So we had to change that structure, and we did that a few years ago, where we took the co-op, and we still have the co-op as a part of our industry. And it's run as a co-op with patrons that get paid their patronage and handled like any co-op. But on the other side of that is the Farmers Union Enterprises, which is basically the operating arm of the total business. We constructed the total business into an LLC, a limited liability company, that is made up of Farmers Union Enterprises on the one side and FUMPA, Farmers Union Marketing and Processing Cooperative, on the other. So we still have our patrons doing business with their co-op. We have the non-patrons doing business with the other side of the business. We're running it and operating it all together so that everybody gets their fair share, cooperatively and on the other side of the business. And we run the whole business under that operating structure of Farmers Union Industries. So it's become a good business. We have all the efficiencies of a good co-op and the efficiencies of another business in that we've got them all gelled together. We're very lean on our organizational structure. I'm very lean on our, I guess you'd call us the business management side of it. We've got a total employee of about 300 now in the total company, so we employ a lot of people and run a good business. And that's allowed us to go on with the cooperative side that we can do cooperatively for those who want to be members of that co-op. We can still have farmers be patrons that lose dead stock, and we can have farmers that lose dead stock that don't want to be patrons. They don't have to. So it works both ways.
How about the evolution of the relationship with the Farmers Union organizations from the 5 states, Groth and South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Montana? Is that always?
It's always been there when I've been associated with it. It's been constant. We've had a few ups and downs at times when you get a renegade board member or you get a renegade Farmers Union president or somebody that's only looking at their side of it, but you handle those issues and keep going forward. We've got a pretty good working group right now, working together. Oh, there's, when a board member gets replaced, sometimes there's some hard feelings for a time, but it's moving forward quite well.
Would you like to talk a little bit about, you've also been involved over the years in efforts to establish some sort of a beef processing facility in South Dakota, most recently with Ridgefield, but there's, I think, an effort in the Aberdeen area, and then there have been other efforts, farmer rancher efforts.
There's been a number of efforts over the years. We've always been in the beef industry here on our farm. We've fed cattle and raised purebred Limousin cattle. So we've been in the beef industry all our lives.
You had a meat business here for a while.
We did. We sold meat off the farm. We also had an identified meat business that we sold meat to the West Coast for a few years, to Texas, to Detroit. We shipped quite a little beef. When the beef industry changes, and that industry has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. We rode with those changes, and we knew we could never go out and compete with the big boys, so we never tried to build a slaughter plant here, and we never tried to do any of those things. We just marketed a line of beef that had some niches that worked for us. When the big beef industry boys started close trimming beef, taking a lot of the fat off and shipping a better product, that kind of took us out of that niche market. After that happened, we started selling. Most of our beef goes to a niche market called Laura's Lean Beef. It's a lean natural beef program. We don't feed as much corn here as a lot of people feed their beef cattle. We like them lean and without a lot of fat in them or on them. So it gives us some positives in the meat market, and we're still doing that today. As far as being directly involved in a slaughter plant in South Dakota, there's a number of times they have tried to put them together here. I've talked to and attended meetings of some of those efforts. We've never invested in any of those. When the Ridgefield people came to South Dakota, about 3-4 years ago now, I attended the first meeting in Pierre when I was there in the legislature with the guys that came in, and I had supper with them. We never got involved in that particular effort directly here for the simple fact that we don't raise Hereford cattle, and we've got our own marketing that we've been doing, so I didn't want to be involved, and I didn't have time to be involved. Well, as things progressed, they ran into some huge problems. Some of their own making. We tried through FUI, tried to rescue the company. We lent them some money to try and maintain the company and bring it forward. We weren't able to do that because they were too far gone. Many mistakes were made in that company, and they were made by a lot of different people. It's sad. To the point where I could almost write a book on what's happened there. And South Dakota didn't need that black mark. The investors in this state didn't need that black mark. They didn't need those losses, and it's a sad deal.
There was also an effort preceding that to establish a kind of a feedlot and an ethanol plant combined along the Missouri River. You want to talk about that effort? There, the farmer money was collected, but the additional credit that was needed didn't happen.
Yeah, we a whole group of us, and we had a lot of investors in the state that put money up. A small group of us lost some money in that effort because we were the organizers of it. We lost our initial investment, not our total investment, but our initial investment was lost. The project was a worthwhile project. It was a new project. Bankers, investors had never seen anything like that before. The farmer investors, the cattlemen, they were willing in South Dakota. We put together almost $30 million to build that project. When we got done, the lenders in this country weren't ready for anything like that. Since that time, there's been a project a lot like it built in Nebraska. It started up and running this last fall. They've had a few initial startup problems, and they're working through those. There's also some other investors wanting to put together projects very similar to that. I think it's...
I think I heard of one in Indiana.
It could be. I haven't heard of that one. I know the one down at Meade, Nebraska is up and operating. I was to a meeting with an investor that is interested in building 3 or 4 of them in South Dakota. But that hasn't happened at this point, so time will tell. The interesting thing is, when you look at all of our ethanol development in South Dakota, we would be very wise if we could put a large feedlot or 2 right alongside of those, and use that wet distiller's grains rather than drying it and spending that money, and rather than trucking it long distances, using that to feed cattle. And then this project was going to use the manure to create methane gas to fire the ethanol plant. Very aggressive but very efficient process. And it does work. We will see that happen a lot in the future, because they're going to be, that ethanol plant and that feedlot has so many efficiencies built into the system that it will survive when many others won't. And they will happen. So it's a matter of time.
We do in the state contend a little bit with the questions of the size of feedlots that people want to see.
We do, and we've got an issue here from people that don't want to see anything over a small family unit.
Yep.
We've also got the issue of environmentalists here that don't understand what's environmentally friendly and what isn't.
Yep.
We went through the process here this last summer and fall of trying to permit our particular farm here in the feedlot. We've abandoned that as to what we were trying to do, because our water table here is fairly high, but our water table isn't used for any water consumption.
There's a big slough out west of here.
There's a lot of sloughs here, but the water doesn't run to any river or to any stream or to any lake or to any... Nobody's drinking it. Nobody can stick a well in it and drink it.
Yeah.
So I contend that the water that falls here stays here and doesn't pollute anything. What's our problem? But under the laws and plans the way they're written, they told us that, yeah, we can go ahead and do this. You have to build an above ground lagoon, and we have to haul clay in about 15, 20 miles to line that 18 inches thick, and then we've got to pump our water into it that runs off the feedlot. Well, you put all those costs together, and there's no point in even considering such a thing. So we've abandoned those plans. And if we want to increase the size of our feedlot, we've got to do it in buildings or something else. It's the only way we can do it.
You want to talk about some of the folks you had a chance to work with at FUMPA? You've had a number of general managers over there. Look at Eddie Wheeland.
Eddie Wheeland was president when I went in. Very energetic, very smart, bright fella. When he decided to retire, it was a disappointment to the board. He retired because he knew that he was getting Alzheimer's, which was sad to watch, but a very good president. Gordon Sherbein succeeded him, came up through the company. After he was there I believe about 5 years, we lost him to a heart attack. And after that, Jerry Letters filled in. Now we're going with our fourth one. And Don has done an excellent job. He's kind of talking about retirement, but maybe in 4 or 5 years. He's not sure yet. So time will tell on that. Okay. But they've all been good managers. All been good presidents. Their style changes, from one to another. There's always style changes, but they've all been easy to work with. Don, I think, is our most aggressive business manager. Likes to see good things happen. It's likes, whether it's the biodiesel plant or the pet grade food industries and the kitty litter company, and I mean, that's being progressive. That's being real energetic and anxious to make good things work. And he's done a very good job of that. But you have to get a little bit used to the changes as you go in, working with a new president and their style and so forth. But it's been very interesting. I've learned a tremendous amount of things working with that board over the 27 years.
You've also had a chance to work with a lot of Farmers Union leaders. Do you want to...
Well, when I first became acquainted with Farmers Union and started working, Tony Deschamps was our national president. And Tony was, again, one of those energetic, guys out there to make a point and make it work. I still remember when he appointed me to that Future of Agriculture Committee. It was a learning experience, second to none. And Tony did a lot of good things for Farmers Union. He was a good spokesman for the National Farmers Union. I believe Cy Carpenter succeeded him, or did George Stone? George Stone succeeded him. George was a little more laid back, from Oklahoma, a little different style, a little different. Goals were a little different, and so forth. So Farmers Union didn't do a lot in those few years. Yeah. Cy Carpenter was again more of a regional guy than a full bore, cover the country kind of guy. So little different style again. Of course, when Lee Swenson was elected, that Lee was out trying to work for everybody, doing it for the whole world if he could. Yeah. That was kind of his goal. Everybody in any of these positions has some shortcomings, and that happens. We're human. Yep. So I've seen. I think some of our better days are coming right now. You look at Tom Bias and his attitude and his ability to work with people in Washington. I think he's going to do a lot of good with Farmers Union.
You see a change there? It seems to me like in the early years when I was involved with the organization, it seemed like there were more people that wanted 100% or nothing. I think it seems to me like today maybe there's more of a willingness to work to get the best we can get without planting our feet.
I think that's cement. Probably true, but I think that's true of all facets, not just Farmers Union. Yeah. People need to deal with reality.
Pragmatism a little bit.
Yeah. Perception is fine, but it's not reality. You've all of politics, all of working together. It doesn't matter if you're in a church or if you're in a government or if you're in Farmers Union or your school or wherever you're working. It's all political in nature to some extent, and you always have to deal with realism to get the best you can for those people involved. And if you're not going to do that, you shouldn't be there. You're shortchanging your industry, your group, your church, your whoever. You're shortchanging them if you're not working together.
Yeah.
And I've seen way too many people be willing to let it die rather than make it better, and that's sad.
Leadership of the state organization. Your earlier years would have been when Ben Radcliffe was president. You've seen an evolution there too. We talked about Lee Swenson's years, but
the biggest evolution that I think that I've seen change there was something that we didn't do that we should have done. When I first got on the board back in the 70s, some of us saw that our funding was going to change, that Farmers Union was going to change. It had to change. It couldn't keep doing what we'd done in the 50s and 60s. And many of the leaders that were on the board at that time, and including Ben, they weren't ready for that change. Ben admits it today. He knows that we should have made changes in our bylaws. He openly admits it. We should have changed our ways with GTA and Senex. We could have done a lot more things together, and it would have been good for the Farmers Union, but we didn't, and that's too bad. We weren't looking out. It's one of the things that I see probably is the greatest shortcoming of all of the groups that you work with, including politicians. We like to look at the next election. We like to look the next year or the next 2 years. We don't look out there 5 and 10 and 20 years like we should, and that creates problems for those who come after us. We should be looking out a long ways. What do we do today to make it better 10 years from now and 20 years from now? And I contend that if we always did that, we'd all be much, much further ahead. So that's some of our failings. Again, styles change. When Ben was on the board, basically, whatever Ben wanted to do, the board said that's fine. When Lee got on the board, or when Lee got to be president, he pretty well run the organization. He'd been there from when he was a kid, basically, and everybody said, yeah, that's fine, go ahead and do it, and that's the way it was run. Of course, when Dallas took over, it got to be hard times. There wasn't money, and there wasn't, it was tough. And in the later years, the Farmers Union Insurance Company has been a great help. Dennis tried to change some of the direction of the Farmers Union as far as looking out ahead, as far as planning for the future, as far as, rather than being reactive all the time, to be proactive. That was where Dennis really tried. He just wasn't real successful at it with a lot of people, but he tried hard to be progressive, to be proactive, rather than being reactive and setting our feet and sliding like many of them wanted to do. That's the one thing Dennis really tried to do that I give him a lot of credit for. Wasn't real successful at it. All of us could be better communicators. All of us could find better ways to do things at times.
Recognizing all the time that in all of these things, you have to be a bit of a politician.
You have to. There's no way to get around it. You have to try and please a lot of people. You have to try and convince a lot of people with what you say and how you say it, and and it's tough.
Yep.
It's a tough job.
Yep. How would you evaluate the state of agriculture in South Dakota today? Do you find it more encouraging today than maybe it was, 5 or 10 years ago, or is it less so?
There's areas that I'm really encouraged about. I think we're going to see more change and more opportunity in agriculture in the next 5 to 10 years than probably 5 to 10 years any of us have experienced. And I really believe that. And I say that from a number of perspectives. Looking at energy and its role in today's agriculture. It's a wide open field. We're just starting in it. Ethanol, is a big success story. Ethanol is a very small part of that whole field. Wind energy, methane gas, carbon sequestration, all of those have a great future for agriculture. We need to be involved in it. We need to be out there progressively talking about it and educating people as to what the future is in that whole area. I've worked in the last 3 years now with a group called Powering the Plains, and it's a group that works with renewable energies and talking about how do we change what we've been doing, how do we address climate change, how do we make the economy work with the new fields of energy? How do we develop all of this? Done an in-depth research project looking at the future in the upper Midwest of agriculture and of energy needs and energy development to, number one, be carbon neutral, and number two, be economically efficient and work with everybody that's here, including the power companies, including the energy companies and everybody. We've got a project there that shows, and we put a lot of research into it with the University of Minnesota and with the others involved in this whole project, that shows that by 2050 we can be carbon neutral in the whole upper Midwest, have energy growth, and do it with no more than a 20% increase in the total cost of energy over that time span. Now, that's huge if you stop and look at it. And we've got a lot of people that are just saying, it's not possible. We've got to use our coal like we've been using it. We've got to use our oil like we've been using it. And we're saying, no, we've got to do better than we've been doing. And when you look at that whole area, that's huge for agriculture, whether it's putting a wind tower out there, whether it's using methane gas from your hog and your dairy and your beef setup, doing all of the things to generate electricity, to run down the wires. It's all a part of it. Hydrogen development for our vehicles, for our tractors. A lot of people want to develop hydrogen for use on the highways. Why do you want to develop hydrogen for use on the highways? When hydrogen says you need to have a lot of weight in a tank, hydrogen best use would be in tractors out here plowing the fields, pulling the heavy weights, doing what we need to do with big engines, construction equipment. Hydrogen's a lot better there than it is in this little car out here running around. But we haven't thought far enough ahead on so many of those issues. So that's all in the development stage. Even the raising of our livestock. We're changing livestock so dramatically. What's happened in the beef industry and the hog industry in the last 30 years is huge. What's going to happen in the next 30 is a lot bigger. Because we're feeding livestock today on 25% less feed stocks than we did earlier. And it's through genetics, it's through feed balancing, it's through a lot of things. We're doing that, and it's going to get a lot better yet. Energy development plays in with livestock feeding. So there's so many things that are changing and changing dramatically. I had a guy that buys cattle for us was fussing about the high price of corn a while back, when corn went to 3.5 and close to 4. They're going to kill the cattle industry. I said, no. I said, if you were feeding poultry and pork, you might have something to fuss about. But I said, I can decide if I want to put a beef on the market with 30 bushel of corn or 80 bushel of corn. And there's a lot of difference. And we can do that today. So it is changing. I believe in family agriculture, wholeheartedly do. But family agriculture is not going to be what it was 20 and 40 years ago, and it's not going to be what it is today. We can still have family agriculture in ownership and in shared risk and in doing all of those things. We can still have family agriculture. But it's not going to be a guy out here with 30 dairy cows and 50 stock cows and 50 sows, and that's not going to be the world we live in. But we can still have family agriculture with shared risk, with shared ownership, with all of the other things. One of the bright spots in agriculture right now, you see land rollers being used now. And nobody ever thought that we'd see big land rollers rolling the seedbed after you plant beans. But proof is, you can run 3 to 5 bushel an acre better if you use one of those. They're very high priced to buy for what you use them for. But 3 or 4 or 5 farmers can own one. So we need shared ownership.
And that used to happen with thrashing equipment way back.
It happened years ago. But we all get independent, and then we do things we shouldn't be doing. Yeah. And share a land roller, share a silage chopper, share the big equipment. And it's better for everybody. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that can happen. You look at our Hutterite colonies here. There's one up here that's 6 miles north of me. There's one that's 4 miles over this way. The way they raise hogs, the way they farm, they've got just as many people on the land as they ever have. But they're doing it right. They're doing it and making money doing it. And we need to learn. So that's the challenge for agriculture today.
Yeah, we see that they have put up a turkey plant now.
Yes.
And we see them. They seem to be making money with it.
Well, I think it'll be a success. I don't doubt that. It's going to take some time, like any new plant, but they'll make it work.
Yeah. What? We're almost to the end of my questions here. What kind of advice
before you go any further, do you want a Coke or a cup of coffee or a
No,
bottle of water? Or?
I'm all right.
Okay.
I'm all right. I was drinking water on the way up here. I'm going to. I guess I am going to go back to a couple or three questions that I have here. How important do you think cooperative education is? Do you think people understand cooperatives today the way they did when the cooperatives were organized?
I think they understand once they hear it, but our co-ops today are different than they were. You look here in Britain, we used to have a Senex station in Britain. Well, now that station is 100 miles from one end to the other. The business is done differently.
Yep.
It's done with a different purpose. We need to have our co-op education keep up with the changes in co-op. And we need to tell our youth and tell our world around us that a co-op is not just the gas station or the elevator like it used to be. Our co-op can be the ownership of a Land Rover. Our co-op can be the ownership of a combine. Our co-op can be the ownership of a shared feedlot with 10,000 head of cattle in it. Those are the kinds of co-ops that we should be looking at. And that cooperative structure can still work everywhere for everybody. But the structures and the laws are going to have to be some different. A few years ago, when I was still in the Senate, I tried to get our co-ops to rewrite the co-op laws in South Dakota. We need to do that badly because they have not kept up. And we've got a lot of current modern co-ops sitting out here that are sitting on the edge of an abyss when it comes to their statutory laws as they are in South Dakota statute book. And we shouldn't be in that position. We should be keeping those laws up. We should be rewriting many of those laws to take care of our current co-op structures and what our current co-ops need to be. And we haven't done that.
What kind of advice would you give someone today if they were thinking about getting started in farming? Assuming they had a father who's going to help them.
Well, that's the big issue is how do you get started? You can't bore in or do it all at once because there's not enough money available. You've got to start small. You've got to find somebody we need, and I'd like to see Farmers Union involved in this, we need a process that we can put the retiree together with the young people. Some states have done some of that. We need to do that because that's the best way to help them get started. And that's the best way to hand something off.
Yeah, Leonard Benson, I've kind of tried to document in the paper some of the stuff he's been doing with a young rancher out west.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen anywhere near enough.
No, it doesn't happen enough, and to have that ability to put that together, is huge. It's not easy. Yeah. You've got to have people that can work together, and you've got to have, everything's going to be a little different. You can't write up a pattern and say this is the way to do it. So it's not easy, but we need to do some of that. And if a guy has no other way to get in, that would be an ideal way if you can find that retiree or that person that wants to get started.
Yeah. Takes a commitment on both sides.
It does, absolutely does. It's not one of these deals where the present owner is going to get the most money he could possibly get out of it. It's not going to happen that way. Yeah. They both got to be flexible and be able to make it work.
They have to consider how much they care about the future of their community.
That's right. Yeah.
Would you describe yourself, and I think I know how you're going to answer this, as an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm a optimist, but I'm also a realist. I'm not a dreamer.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of possibilities, I think, that can happen if people work together. You know, I could see this state making huge progress in a short time if we changed our tax laws. I could see this state making huge progress with energy. But most people don't want to step out and do that. And I don't believe in taking an unreal amount of risk to do that either. But I think in working together we can minimize risk and we can still have it. You look at what Minnesota has done. They haven't charged their people a bunch of extra money on their electric bills, and look what they've done with wind energy and with all of the rest of it.
Is there anything else that you would like to add? I never know what I'm going to get as an answer here. Anything I didn't ask you you'd like to talk about?
Well,
you did. I did have a note back here that you had received an Eminent Farmer Award.
Yes, I did.
And a Meritorious Service Award, I think, from Farmers Union.
Well, I've received a couple of awards from Farmers Union over the last 3 years that I never expected. Meritorious Service and the President's Award this last year. They're both, they're humbling. You don't ever think you're doing anything to deserve that. The Eminent Farmer Award, my father got that back in, I believe, 70-something, 78 or 9. And I was totally flabbergasted when that came my way. I never dreamt that I would ever receive something like that. They're very good programs. There's so many people that are deserving of those awards. But I've just enjoyed working with Farmers Union. Sure, I've had days when I when I wondered why, But it's always been a pleasure to work towards goals, and I've made so many good friends. A lot of people ask me if I miss the legislature. I said no, but I miss the good friends that I made, And there's a number of them. Like, went to that reception the other day, and Larry Gabriel was just flabbergasted when Duxbury and I walked in there. And I called. I hadn't even thought about calling Dux, and when I come in to get ready, I said to Faye, I'm going to call Dux and see if he's going, because I expect he probably is. Well, no answer. So I took his phone number along, and at noon hour I called him. Yeah, he says, I was planning on going. He says, you want to meet me in Miller? You ride with me. You bet, he said. And interesting, when we got there was no current legislators at that reception.
Really?
None. Just, I couldn't believe it. There was us 2 Democrats, and there were 2 Republicans. Jan Nicolai come in just before it was over, but otherwise Roger Porch was the only one that other there, and of course he served with Larry for years, from the same district, So that was the only legislators that were there, and I thought, geez, that doesn't sound right.
And some of the legislators who are still there, or maybe switched houses a couple of times.
Yeah,
but
some of them have, but there's many of them that served with him that are still there.
Yeah.
And served with him as Ag Secretary, but also served with him in the actual House.
Yeah.
And they weren't there, and that surprised me. But there were many of the lobbyists that I worked with, and of the ag lobbyists, they were there. The I guess you'd call them the retired cabinet people. Many of those were there, and a lot of good friends that were there. I got to greet a lot of people there that day. And almost to a person, they said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "I don't intend to." So, but it's been fun on the way, and I've just been fortunate to have a family that would let me do that.
To be gone for not everybody has a.
Not everybody can do that.
For 2 months everywhere.
Yeah.
Plus other meetings.
And both Farmers Union wise, FUMPA wise, legislative wise. Faye's kept the family together and done all that a lot better than I could have. So
Anything else?
No, that's about it, I think.
We've been visiting with Paul Symens. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.